So everybody got that notice? So watch what you say. Just kidding. Say whatever you want. That's part of what we're here to talk about. It stays internal, so that's all that matters. All right, so today I want to do it just slightly differently. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the things that we're thinking about working on. We want to go over the listing, or excuse me, the buyer agency agreement. See, it's the listing agreement for the buyer. Anyway, over the buyer agency agreement and get those questions out on the table. Make sure that everybody has an opportunity to kind of think about or ask some of the questions they have. Let's start by just talking about some of the things that we know. Does anybody want to add something that they know? Something that they know about the buyer agency agreement, or that they know about where we're at and why this is all coming to be? Anybody want to throw something out? Let's talk about something we know.
I remember buyer agency coming about around 1996, right around when the internet was popular. And I guess it's totally different now, or is it the same?
Well, I don't know that it's, I mean, it's all buyer agency or working with buyers has always been part of what we do.
With an actual document.
So I think you might be thinking about when we, 100 years ago, when I first started with hammers and chisels, you had to disclose your agency, and then probably about late 1990s, state of Florida said, look, you don't have to disclose it anymore because you guys are screwing it up as it is. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to tell everybody that you're transaction brokerage. So that applied to both buyers and sellers. And then, of course, probably about 6 years ago, the first agency agreements, well, in Florida started to come up. They've been around for quite a bit of time in a lot of other states where buyers and realtors have an agreement that indicates what their representation is or what their agreement is to work together, what the time frame is, and then we'll discuss open the conversation to compensation and create greater transparency. In Florida, we haven't been pushing it until probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Florida Realtors has a buyer agency agreement, and then of course NEFAR, because NEFAR has our set of own agreements or documents, created one. MLS has created that. That has recently been updated as of December. A little more straightforward. That's what we're going to be going over. And then there will be one more change to that. It was voted to bring in mediation arbitration back in to that agreement. So that's the addition that will be coming probably, I would say, end of February, beginning of March. But for the most part, the document will remain as it is. Anybody want to add to that? Separate from that? Insight?
So just to
Thank
just
you.
to expand on what you were saying, can you hear me?
Yes, please go right ahead.
Okay. There's currently 26 states that use buyer agency agreements as a part of their business. It's not always mandated but there are licensees in 26 states are currently using it. I became really concerned with using it, not concerned in a bad way, but concerned, gee, we should start using this, when I took the ABR course, and which was like 3 years ago or so, and started incorporated it in my business a couple of years ago, before these court cases came out. Now, because of the lawsuits, National Association of Realtors and Florida Realtors is really promoting the use of it, so that number one, it forces realtors to sit down and have the conversation with the buyer about, here's what my expectation is for payment, here's my expectation for you as a customer, and here's what you can expect from me. Because we have not done a good job of explaining any of that in the past, which is what has led to the lawsuits.
And to add on to what Misty's saying, which I think is very relevant, is if you look at not only the lawsuits, but if you look at the discussions that are taking place, what we're really looking at is greater transparency. Right. And if you look at where this all started back with the DOJ's around that, the DOJ. Their big thing is you guys aren't being transparent, you're inflating prices, you're colluding, you're violating antitrust. Whether we believe what they say or not, and in many cases we don't necessarily agree, what it's in challenging us to do, which I think is an extremely good opportunity for us, is to establish and communicate value. We haven't been challenged to do that with our buyers. And that's why we want to have these discussions, at least right now, so that we can establish as a team and share with each other what we believe our value is to the buyer. And if you look at the document that's in the chat, that's the 105, that 105 tasks really focuses on the things you do for a buyer.
Mhm.
Will you always use that? Maybe, maybe not. Can we help you get that incorporated into your buyer consult? Maybe, maybe not. Our goal is to help you establish the buyer consult, do exactly what Missy was talking about, have the discussion of the value that you bring to the transaction, and establish transparency when it comes to how you get paid. Bottom line is, we want to ensure that you get paid. We want to ensure that you get compensated for the wealth of knowledge you have, the amount of time and energy you spend, and the work that you do. So that is a great opportunity for us to start the discussion on that buyer agency agreement. I'm going to go ahead and put it up on the screen. I'll share my screen with you guys so that we have that available just to have a discussion from. And this is the 105 reasons that are in front of you right now. So hopefully the 105 reasons are in front of you right now. Can everyone see that? Okay, and
Clark, what's interesting, there was a Facebook thing that went around, I don't know, a month or a couple months ago, and about all of the different tasks that an agent does for a buyer. And I shared that. And one of my most active customers, who's also a very good friend, who has bought and sold a lot of real estate and typically always uses a realtor, right? And since she's been in Jacksonville, she always uses me. And she commented on that and said, I had no idea of everything that you do behind the scenes. She said, she said, you're awesome, but I had no idea. And that's the thing. We don't talk about how the sausage is made to our customers. We show up and open up a door and they think, oh, well, this is nothing. This is easy. They didn't think about the 3 hours we just spent researching and making showing appointments and preparing document packages, all of that.
right. And when you
So I
combine,
just want to, I mean, that's an example of here's somebody that's done this over and over and over again, working with an agent, and yet had no idea.
sure. So, and the other one that was in there is this 179 ways. So looking at that, I mean, if you even just combine those, it's well over 200, almost 300 pieces of what we do in our daily lives to help people get their homes sold and buyers get into a home. And I love that you put it out on social media because it gave people an opportunity to not only digest it, but an opening. You can always offer it as a resource too, that you'd be happy to send it out. So it's a way to try and get interaction from social media. Hey, have you seen the 105 ways I can help you with buying your home? You know, reach out and I'll send it to you. So a couple of different ways. All right, well, let's jump into the buyer agency agreement just to make sure we are focused on the transaction buyer agency agreement. That is this form here. Excuse me. So hopefully you were able to pull it down or have it from a previous email or from the forms. We are using the one from 12/23. Again, there will only be a slight change where mediation and arbitration will be added back into this. Kind of want to take it out in blocks and open up the discussion too. I can see people. I can't always see. If you raise your hand, I should be able to see. If I miss you and you have something you want to add or a question you want to throw out there, please just hop on, open your mic and say, hey, I have a question. It's not disruptive at all. We want to make sure that your thoughts and concerns get out there. What we know, the other part about what we know is that our business is changing. That's one thing I think that we forgot to mention is our business is changing. And again, change is scary sometimes, but it's not bad. It'll challenge us to be better. And hopefully what it will do is those of you who are doing so, are so strong into your business, it's those ones on the outer peripheral that it may drop off. So competition may shift also, but the stronger, and that's what we're trying to prepare you for is how this will all play out. All right, so this is a buyer agency agreement for transaction broker. Is there a separate one for single agency? Yes, there is. We work as transaction brokers at this time, and that's what we'll be focusing on. The agreement is between the buyer and the brokerage. So it's very similar to a listing. I can't remember who said it at one of the last discussions. It's like a listing agreement with your buyer is really what you're doing. You're creating that connection with the buyer, that commitment from the buyer for you. And it's going to open that discussion a little more clearly for transparency and for value. I think it challenges us to be value. So the buyer's exclusive agent is going to work with and assist the buyer in locating and negotiating, or just a little bit, the acquisition of real property. And acquisition, they even identify acquisition and acquire. This is for purchase, option, exchange, lease, or other acquisition of an ownership or other interest in real property. So this is a form that you would use if you're working with someone who's interested in leasing, renting, month to month, annual, whatever form that ownership or that acquisition takes place. This form can be used for both. The individual licensee of the broker who signs this agreement on behalf of the broker. Please remember what you're doing is signing this on behalf of the brokerage. So just like a listing agreement, there will be forms in altering this, or if you need to amend this, there's a way to do that. If you need to extend it, that can be done via email, just like an extension on a listing agreement. The individual licensee signs on behalf of the brokerage shall be primarily responsible for performing the duties of broker hereunder, but it is agreed that other licensees of the broker may be appointed by the broker to fulfill such duties if deemed appropriate by the broker. Don't think that really is too shocking to anybody. What that means is, if you've got a buyer that you're working with and you go on vacation, obviously, and we want to make sure that the buyer is taken care of, you may have someone that you work with regularly to help you out when you are in need. And that's great. And if that person is not part of the signing of this agreement, more than one agent can sign if you work as a team. Or if there is a team and the team lead signs the agreement and then one of the team members works with the buyer, we just want to make sure that the compensation comes and flows through to you. So of course, this means that if anybody else works with that buyer and it goes to consummation or close, that we, the brokerage, and you, the associate, would still be compensated. Clear? Thumbs up, head nods on anybody who's on screen. Okay, we're good. All right, okay. I don't think that comes as much of a surprise. So that's a good thing. It's protecting you. Here's where sometimes we get some questions, or we've had some questions, which I appreciate always. The agreement will begin on a certain date and will terminate at a certain time on a certain date. Very similar to your listing agreements. It should be for a period of time. How long? How long do you think? What's the average time for a buyer from starting to show property to going under contract and then closing? What do you think? What do you think the average?
4 months.
I always put a year in there.
The buyer, maybe 6 months.
I've got 4 months, maybe 6 months. I'm sorry, Missy, you said please?
I put a year in. I put 1 year.
I think that this is different than listings. And I think that suggestion of a year is probably the best to work with, because once you find the property or starting that relationship, NAR tells us that it's about a 12-week process to get to contract. Then you're talking 30 to 45 days to close. We understand that market conditions can shift that. Hazel, did you have something? I saw you pop on there for a second. You had something you wanted to add? You good?
No, I'm trying to get my volume up, but I think I can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. What I'll try and do is turn mine up too. Okay. So, oops, excuse me. All right. So I think that I would agree, and as we put our policies together, we'll tell you what we're recommending, but I think that the recommendation of 1 year is excellent. You don't know, especially in tighter markets, and we're still only running at about 6,800 listings. In tighter markets, you may end up having to make multiple offers on properties or potentially go under contract multiple times until you can finally find the right property. So I think a year is probably a strongly recommended time frame for a customer. Can it be extended? Absolutely, it can be extended. Should that be done in writing? Absolutely, that should be done in writing. Can it be terminated? Yes, it can be terminated, and we'll get to that termination portion. However, if the buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property that is pending on the termination date, the agreement will continue in effect until the transaction is consummated or is otherwise terminated. So if you are working with someone, now notice that the terminology here is that is pending. That's one of the discussions that went back and forth on this agreement. Active contingent is considered pending. So you are covered, but that is one of the things that we're looking at finding is expanding the definition on so it's clear to everyone that a change in status from active to active contingent, or which is now called contingent taking backups, something like that, and then pending would be covered. Was there a comment that I missed? The second paragraph really talks about type of property. You may notice this from the previous buyer agency agreement. This has been reduced slightly to say residential, commercial. Can it be both? Absolutely. So if your customer is looking for residential property and commercial property, you would check both boxes. If you're working with them solely for commercial, that's fine. And then general location. There's been a lot of questions on general location. Feedback. Anybody want to throw something out there?
The county.
The county, okay. County is a good one. Yeah. But
are
remember,
you?
NEFAR covers 5 to 6 counties. So if you're working within the NEFAR MLS or within real MLS, you're talking about 5 different counties. Missy, you had a comment?
Are you still, is my screen frozen or are you still on the first page?
I'm still on the first page. Am I moving?
Okay, because it stops with me on 3F. That's as far down as I can see.
Okay, so we're still up at number 2 under type of property.
Okay, all right, sorry.
I'm sorry. Is that better for you there? Can everyone
Yeah.
see where we're
Yeah,
at?
it's fine. I thought you were somewhere else in the form.
You had us moving along much faster, huh? I got to read faster. So general location, just be conscious. We've had suggestions for Jacksonville or anywhere deemed acceptable to the buyer. We've had greater Northeast Florida. We've had Duval, Clay. We've had people be more specific about Duval, Clay. Please remember with the general location, again, keyword general. Right now, Real MLS covers 5 definite counties and into 6. So what's the area that your customer is looking at? Do customers change their mind? Definitely. How do you want to protect yourself? What I will say is that the attorneys have warned us if we say Florida or Florida in general, that should someone go to another location like Tampa, and
Excuse me.
bless you, and they go to Tampa and then buy something there, and based on this agreement, we try and force and enforce compensation, we would probably get discounted, in part because of the code of ethics, which talks about knowing your area and focusing on staying in your lane, if you will, for lack of a better term, but also because how can we be efficient in some other areas that we may not know as well, or that we may not be able to access as well. So general location, I believe that if you're using Northeast Florida, you're probably pretty good. If you are if you're being more specific, just make sure that you're sure or clear on what the customer is asking. All right, we go right into our transaction brokerage obligation. So we are on paragraph 3. If you're looking at the screen, hopefully you can see between 2 and 3B.
I do have a question for a
Yes,
second on
okay,
B,
sure.
or actually on C, when we say the range. What if our customer can't afford a lot and they haven't given us a range yet? We haven't looked at properties, so they don't know what their range is. Can I just write in to be determined by the buyer?
Okay, we may be looking at different agreements. The agreement that we're looking at is dated 12/2023, and
I uploaded it. Oh, okay, yeah, it's the 18 one. Okay, makes sense.
Okay.
We need to get it out of app files then, because this is what I just uploaded.
Okay, I'll deactivate that in app files.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so the 12/23 one should be the only one. I thought I had taken all that out.
Okay, no
But I'll
problem.
check
I'll delete
again.
this one.
I'll check again. Yeah, so good point, good differentiation. The property type, one of the things that was removed was price range. So,
Okay.
so that's a good observation on the difference in the two. So we have now pointed out, because this is transaction broker, we are disclosing our obligations as per the duties of a transaction broker. So we identify the duties: dealing honestly, fairly. None of these should be shockers to anyone, I hope. These are our items. Now, again, I think that there are going to be brokerages which profess to be single agent brokerages, trying to use single agency as a means of differentiation. However, when they do have the transition to transaction brokerage agreement signed at the time they have them sign the agency agreement, they really are transitioning to transaction brokerage. I understand that the transition to transaction brokerage says may be needed. However, there are certain things you can only transition into once, and one of them really is, when you're moving from single agent to transaction brokerage. So the things I think that we need to be we need to keep top of mind are that our customers are most concerned. Well, first of all, let's be real. Our customers don't care for single agent transaction broker. They don't know the difference.
Mm-hmm.
They want you to either help them find something, or they want you to help them sell their home. Mm-hmm. When we talk to Freck about what comes in front of them, it's rarely agency that comes in front of them. However, how you act becomes very important when you understand how agency works, and you have a responsibility to your customers to ensure that they understand a little bit about your responsibilities, and that comes under agency.
And you don't want to be ambiguous, telling them they could transition to a transaction broker at the same time, because that sounds ridiculous.
Okay. Missy, it looked like you were talking or had something to say, but you were on mute. So did you want to add to that, please?
It was more me talking to myself. I just said they don't understand. Even when we try to explain agency, they don't understand. So
right.
Yeah.
You're right. You're exactly right. So we've made it an issue internally. So we have to be able to know how to compete with that. And I think this opportunity for us to talk value is really going to be able to boil down where the differentiation comes in when we compete with brokerages that profess to be single agents. I will continue to say profess. I know that not everyone agrees with that, but that's okay. All right. So, and because what our customers are most concerned about is disclosing things that are going to hurt them in the negotiation. But even as transaction brokers, you can't disclose motivation. You can't disclose that they'll pay more. You can't disclose that they'll pay less. You can't disclose any of that, which are the things that they're most concerned about. It's not only written into the transaction brokerage duties, but it's also identified in our code of ethics in Article 1 and Article 2. So being aware of that becomes very important, at least how to talk and focus on value. I think, I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on transaction brokerage obligations with our customers, but we need to help them understand what our value is as it relates to our performance, not so much the title or tag, transaction versus single agency. Does anyone want to add in anything about the 3A duties or question about transaction versus single agency, or why this is in here? Why this is in here? Okay, so other customers, this is a section that comes out of it, that was added in here in part to remind our buyers that we may be working with other people. So this is a disclosure item that was added in order to assist us in having the conversation with our customers, that there may be an opportunity for us to work with more than one customer who may be interested in the same property. So the buyer understands that the broker may work with other prospective customers who want to acquire the same property as the buyer. If the broker submits offers made by competing customers, the broker will notify the buyer that a competing offer has been made, but will not disclose any of the competing offers, material terms, or conditions without the competing offers written consent, offerers written consent. Remember, the obligation of a listing agent is to disclose if there are multiple offers. One, if the seller says it's okay, and two, the other party has to ask. But we are saying here that you won't, unless the buyer says it's okay to disclose terms and conditions, you won't disclose terms and conditions. Missy, go right ahead.
I actually had a transaction, or I had two customers pretty much looking for the same house at the same time. And they both, one had me write an offer, and within 6 hours, the other customer said, please write an offer. So I had two buyers wanted me to write offers. And I actually went to my broker and said, how do I handle this? And I said, because I've got, I know I'm a transaction broker, but what her advice to me was, go back to both buyers and tell them that the situation that you're in, and leave it up to them. Do they want me to handle their transaction, or I can partner with another agent in the office and have them handle it? And I gave the first choice to the first buyer who wanted to make the offer, and they said, no, we want to work with you. So, I went back to the second one and said, this is the situation, and this customer has chosen to work with me. I'm going to pair you with another agent in my office, and that way both offers, I'm only aware of one offer, and it's fair to you that this other agent write the offer up, you disclose to them what you want to do, not to me. And then depending on which one gets it, I'll step back in and handle the transaction. But just for the sake of writing up the offer and keeping that confidentiality there that's needed, even with transaction broker, that's the way that it was handled. So it's a rare occasion that it happens, but it did happen.
Yeah.
So I just want to share how I handled that.
I thank you for doing that. And we do have in our policy manual, we talk about how to handle multiple offer situations. We ask you to disclose that there are multiple offers. So we even tell you that we would prefer that you disclose it. We ask you to put the multiple offer notice in MLS. We tell you that if you are writing an offer, if you've written an offer on the property and you have another customer, to come to the general manager or someone else that you know, and they would be happy to either take that over for you, to offer it exactly like Missy has said, to please go ahead and talk to your customers to find out what they want. So it's, that's great. We have those procedures even written, very similar to what Missy has just described. So, yes, sir.
Why do they both want to work with you?
Then they know that you'll know the differences. You still can't talk about the differences unless both parties have agreed to share the terms and conditions of their offers. Remember, we can share terms and conditions of offers, but we have to have approval to do that. We cannot share terms and conditions of contracts.
But she could talk with the seller and say if she can share the conditions with the other person. have both customers, no?
Well, sure, you can write offers for both buyers as long as both buyers know, and that's what this disclosure is. But also in this disclosure here under 3B, we're saying unless the buyer agrees to allow you to disclose the terms and conditions of the offer, you can't do that. So the document for the buyer helps the buyer understand the goal is protection of their offer and the conditions that allow it to be competitive. If you are writing both offers, it's very difficult. You probably should not. You should either come and have me write one of the offers, or someone like Ed, if you guys work together, and keep it separate, because we want to ensure that every buyer has a fair shot at a property. So you shouldn't know if you're writing for buyer one, you shouldn't know what the terms and conditions of buyer two are unless everybody has agreed to share all terms and conditions. So that's why we say we're trying to
It's
keep
being
you.
dishonest. You're writing a lower offer than is already a full price offer. And somebody else wanted to offer 2,000 less or something, and it would be, that's not going to be accepted. It might be a backup, but.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think that our buyers are always going to be looking to us to say, what do you think? What do you think? And if you've already written one offer, it's very hard to separate yourself out to be fair to buyer two without saying, ooh, well, I don't know. I mean, it's not always what you say, it's often how you say it. So to protect yourself and to protect, our policies are to protect yourself, to protect the brokerage, to protect, and most importantly, protect the buyer, that when you get into a situation like Missy's described, bring one of us in. Don't put yourself in a place that you could potentially lose a buyer to somebody else, or that you could potentially lose the respect of the buyer, or that you could lose the relationship, more important. I agree. Yeah. This does let them know that there is the potential for the brokerage to be on both sides of the transaction, and as transaction brokerage, that's possible. Anything anyone wants to add about that before we move on to service providers? All right, service providers. So the broker does not warrant or guarantee products or services provided by any third party whom the broker, at buyer's request, refers or recommends to the buyer in connection with the property acquisition. This is just putting the buyer on notice. You'll see that this is very similar to some of the things that are outlined in the listing agreement. Why? Listing agreement, brokerage and seller, buyer agency agreement, buyer and brokerage. So different sides of the transaction. Fair housing. So, and if you haven't all had an opportunity to do At Home with Diversity or one of the other fair housing courses, please take some time to do that. There's one online through NAR, the Fair Haven, which is beautiful.
What's it called?
At Home with Diversity. Great class. Fantastic. And the Gold Key one is also very, very good. And we have Missy to thank for that. She brought that in when she was president. So thank you for doing that. Fair housing, the broker will present properties to the buyer in full compliance with local, state, and federal housing laws against discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, national origin, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Please note that this is in accordance with the guidelines from NAR. Our state does not have protections for a couple of these that are identified here. But as realtors, we are under the NAR guidelines also, and we always like to hold the bar high. So please be aware that if there's any discussion of any of these status options, this is also why we do not recommend or encourage love letters. Something could be seen in a letter that could potentially have a buyer or seller concerned about, or alter the way that they would negotiate. So fair housing, I know you guys treat everybody fairly, so that's great. I'm not worried about you guys, but just be aware that these are the covered categories, right? Buyer's obligation. So if we've got something to do, guess what? They've got something to do. And this is why this is so great to be able to have this tool, is that not only can we say to them, here's the 105 plus things that I'm going to do for you. These are the only things I ask of you. So that would be things like working exclusively with the brokerage during the term of this agreement, conducting all negotiations and efforts to locate suitable property exclusively through the broker, and referring to the broker all inquiries of any kind from the real estate licensees, property owners, or other sources. So again, see how this is analogous to a listing agreement. So we're connecting with our buyers in a way and asking for commitment from them also. If buyer contacts or is contacted by a seller, a builder, a lessor, or a real estate licensee who is working with a seller or views a property unaccompanied by the broker, the buyer will at first opportunity advise the seller, builder, lessor, or real estate licensee that the buyer is working with and represented exclusively by the broker. So where one of the places that we tend to lose buyers
Open houses.
sometimes, so
Mhm.
open houses, new construction, people, agents don't, or customers don't want to say something, or they don't want to, they just want to kind of go through and check out the decorations of the new construction, get decorating ideas, and then are drawn into the new and nice and shiny, which is true, right? So this helps us remind them. It forces us to bring up all of the different situations that they can be in and remind them how important it is to not only take our card, share our card, but share our information. Why? Because we have a commitment to each other. Right? I've lost one to new construction, I'm sure, but there have been probably others. Providing the broker with proof of funds and or loan pre-approval, ensuring buyer's ability to acquire and or finance the acquisition of real property. So when we're doing our buyer consult, there are really 6 to 9 steps that we need to review with them. This agreement helps us walk through, or can be easily tied into our buyer consult. So there's ways, the way it's written and the way your buyer consult is put together can really dovetail each other.
Right.
Acknowledging these are customary buyers. There are customary buyers closing costs and prepaids, including all loan closing costs, and consulting an appropriate professional for legal, tax, environmental, insurance inspection, and property condition advice, as neither broker nor broker's licensees are experts in tax, legal, financial, property condition, and environmental matters. Broker advises buyer to consult with appropriate professionals on these matters. So we're telling them right up front, here's the things that will help you with, here's the things that we can consult with you on, here's the way that we can help you manage this transaction from A to Z. But we also need you to take on some responsibility and understand that you're going to need to get help, because I can help you only so far. So it's great in that way.
And when you recommend somebody, you need to recommend at least 2 or 3.
No, there's no obligation to do that. And the section that above, that in 3C, that talks about service providers, allows us to go ahead and make a single recommendation. If that's what you have. Now we're expanding our vendor list, but you know, if there was absolutely, if they would like 2 to choose from, and you feel more comfortable doing 2, or you feel more comfortable doing 3, please do. It shows that your team, that you not only have your team put together, but you have options on your team. So the big one, compensation, we're just going to skip right over that. I don't think anybody wants to discuss it, right?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. All right, compensation. So this is the part that I think is going to be the most challenging for some of us, especially those of us who have been in it a long time. Me, since hammer and chisel, but anyway. Compensation. Broker's compensation is earned when, during the term of this agreement and any renewal or extension of this agreement, the buyer or any person or entity acting for or on behalf of the buyer contracts to acquire real property regardless of the manner in which the buyer was introduced to the property. The broker shall seek the compensation from a cooperating broker, or from the seller, or from the builder, or from the lessor. If there is no listing broker, so if there's not a listing broker, we still have an obligation to see or to ask the question if compensation is being offered. That puts the obligation on us. That helps the buyer understand that we're still very active in it. Okay, except as otherwise set forth below, the buyer will be responsible for paying the broker no later than the date, no later than at closing or consummation, the amount specified below, but will be credited with any amount which the broker receives from a seller, a builder, a lessor, or a broker who is working with a seller. So right there, we're saying what we agreed to below, you're obligated to, but if we've discussed it with the seller or the party holding the property, and they're willing to compensate, or there's compensation identified, and we know that compensation is identified for the buyer broker side because we see it on all the listings as of almost 3 years ago. It's been required on all front-facing websites. And we're saying, look, we'll even credit whatever is given to what is we've agreed will be owed. In the event the amount of compensation offered by the listing broker, seller, builder, or lessor is greater than is specified in this paragraph 5, the buyer authorizes the broker to receive such compensation and to retain any such additional compensation without proration or rebate to the buyer. The buyer will pay broker's compensation immediately upon buyer's default on any contract to acquire property. The buyer will pay the broker's compensation if within 120 days after termination, which is the protection period, the buyer contracts to acquire any property which was called to buyer's attention by the broker or any other person, or found or discovered by buyer during the term of this agreement. So just like in the listing agreement, there's a period of time that the brokerage is protected and you are protected. It's the same thing with the buyer. All right, so let's make sure that we're good with all this section 70 through 84. Comments, questions, concerns, opportunities, 70 through 84 before we identify the compensation portion.
Question, can you elaborate where it says buyer broker will seek the compensation? Can you say that typically there is, if it is listed, there is already compensation built into this?
So if you didn't hear the question is, can we state based on the line 73 through 75, broker shall seek the compensation from a cooperating broker? Can we share with the buyer that if it is listed, that there is most often compensation offered? No, we cannot, because in MLS, compensation can be as low as 0.
Okay.
So the seller has no obligation, or at this time, the way the listing agreement is constructed, we would be talking to the seller about the overall compensation and the compensation that's being offered to a cooperating selling broker or broker working with the buyer. However, a seller has a right to say, I will pay you this amount, X dollars or X percent, but I am not interested in paying the buyer's brokerage a percentage at all. So to say that it is common for that to occur would be inaccurate at this time. Missy.
With that, I always, when we're in there, I always say, I will share with you what the listing broker is paying on every listing before we see that property. And you choose whether or not you want to see that property, not me.
Thank you.
And that way it's fully disclosed before we even go see the house. what the compensation is, because now they understand they're going to be on the hook for the difference.
Right.
And if the compensation is less than what I'm requiring, it is the buyer's choice whether or not we go see that property.
And thank you, because that's exactly the resolve that we're going to need to. That's exactly the terminology and words, maybe not exactly how Missy phrased it. You're going to have to find your own words. That's why we're trying to go through this iteration of reviewing this and talking about it and coming up with scripts, and then you're going to have to find your own words. But in today's world, as of roughly 3 years ago, remember, every listing that's out there on the internet shows what the seller is willing to compensate the buyer's brokerage. Therefore, when you have this discussion with your customer, I think the way that Missy is approaching it is accurate. What you want to do is ensure that they understand that they're entered into an agreement with you. If by chance compensation is offered and it's disclosed on every listing we share with them, the buyer, then have the right to say, I'm okay with seeing this property, I'm not okay with seeing this property. You can't make that decision, but they can. So it now also puts an onus on them to ensure they not only understand that compensation is going to be required, how compensation will be paid, and then making the decision of whether they're willing to pay it or not, even though they've entered into an agreement with you. Correct, Diane?
Okay, my question is about the termination and the 120 days. I understand in the listing agreement that how that works, but can you give us examples? Like, okay, so if they terminate our contract, but we've shown them a house and then they go behind our back after terminating it and work a deal with the listing agent, is that what you're talking about? Or it's only if it's terminated, not if it expires, correct? But what if we show them the house and it expires and we're not under contract and they decide not to renew with us?
Well,
Those are the two questions.
Sure. So if a buyer has signed this agreement, so we're looking at the buyer will pay the broker's compensation immediately upon buyer's default. So if they go under contract and then default on it, on any contract to acquire property, buyer will pay broker's compensation if within 120 days after termination, so not expiration, but termination. So if it's terminated early, then the 120-day period steps in. If the contract expires, just like a listing agreement, if the contract expires, so it works basically the same thing. If a contract expires and then they go to a property that was seen, excuse me, or the seller then sells a property that was seen by somebody that saw it while we had it, then we're owed compensation. It's a very similar thing. If the buyer then goes to a property and tries to work a deal with the builder or the seller, we would be entitled to compensation in that 120-day period.
But not if it had expired.
No.
Not if if it had expired, we would still be entitled to compensation unless they have signed an agreement with another brokerage.
Okay, perfect.
So just in a very similar way to the listing agreement, if our listing expires, we're entitled to compensation if the seller sells it to a buyer who saw it while we had it listed. The buyer brokerage agreement works in a very similar way. If they terminate early, the protection period starts for 120 days. If it expires, we still have a protection period of 120 days, unless the buyer enters into another buyer agency agreement with a realtor. Brokerage, excuse me, with a brokerage, excuse me. Does that make sense, Dan?
Yeah, it does. And then I have one more question. So on the very top, are we just writing Legends of Real Estate for the brokerage? We're not writing like Diane Rukav with Legends of Real Estate. We're writing just the brokerage.
We are writing just the brokerage because the next paragraph under that allows, protects you and then, or protects you and the brokerage, and protects you should you need assistance with that buyer at any point in time.
So, okay, it's just like a listing agreement on that. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. That's why we want to have these questions out on the table and make sure everybody's cool. Anything else in 70 through 84 that we want to bring up? It's also written in there, so you're protected should somebody be offering a bonus. Remember, as long as the minimum compensation is, minimum brokerage compensation is accrued, bonuses are paid 100% through to you, so it allows you to get that. Right.
What does that mean?
Where does it say that?
Under line, it says we're allowed to go ahead and keep anything over.
Mhm.
So what does that mean? What is what mean?
Was you're allowed to keep 100%. You mean because even though it's more than what the buyer thought you would get originally, you get to keep it, or you still splitting that with the broker?
But we're talking about bonuses versus compensation. So if what this is saying is that if when we get into the compensation portion that the buyer and the agent have agreed to be compensated 3%, and we're all got no stragglers from other brokerages out there online, right? Okay, so we can talk numbers. So if you've agreed to get paid 3% and the buyer's agreed to pay you 3%, and the contract goes through, but now you've contracted with they've contracted with the builder. And when they contracted with the builder was offering 3% plus $1,000 bonus. As long as the 3% remains, there was no attempt to negotiate the 3% in order to get more of the bonus or something like that. The bonus gets passed through to you at 100% through the brokerage.
Through our brokerage.
Through our brokerage.
We do not share that with you.
As long as you've achieved the minimum requirements for compensation, we pay bonuses through at 100%. Yep. Does that make sense, everybody?
Yeah. You like bonuses.
Yeah. Everybody likes bonuses. All right. On to for purchase. So we're going to break this out a little bit. For purchase, the broker will be paid either a flat fee or a certain percentage of the total purchase price. Select only one. So we're trying to get you, plus a broker transaction fee of. So don't forget $250 on the transaction fee. If you choose to pay it yourself, that's fine too. You can do that for the buyer, just like you can do it for the seller. And where we're at right now is we're still working on policies as to what we believe should be compensation, fair compensation for the brokerage based on buyer representation. At the way it is right now, my head is, so if it were under 500,000, it's right now 6% for buyer and seller, so it would be roughly 3% for buyer. Obviously, if you're making some adjustments for compensation, we still share with you in the 0.5% down to what would be 5.5 or 2.75%. And then if you go off of that, then it's just a difference in the company dollar. For lease or option to purchase, for lease, the broker will be paid a flat fee of a certain dollar amount or a percentage of the lease amount, whichever is greater, to be paid when the buyer enters into the lease. So this is slightly different than consummation. It's when they enter in the lease. Now, obviously, the lease doesn't start for another month. It would still be when they enter into the lease. For the option to purchase, the broker will be paid a flat fee of a dollar amount or a percentage of the option amount. That's the agreed upon purchase option amount, whichever is greater, to be paid when the buyer enters into the option agreement. If the buyer enters into a lease with option to purchase, the broker will be compensated for both the lease and the option.
No, I just think that's a little bit harsh that the broker would keep a certain dollar amount on a lease, because sometimes they only pay you $100, which barely covers your gas. And if you're having to pay your broker $200 on a lease because you took them to an apartment and that's all they pay.
Well, remember what you're saying is a flat fee, which would come through the brokerage, then would be split with you.
But a
So it's
flat
not that the
fee,
brokerage is keeping the fee.
it's not us to tell the apartment how much they can get. They've got a certain amount that they give, and that's it.
Well, but this is the buyer agency agreement. So your agreement is with the buyer. It has nothing to do with the
what they're gonna
apartment
pay.
complex or whatever. So
that
if
you were gonna
if
expect.
your agreement is a flat fee, customarily, I would believe it would be, a percentage most commonly, and this is really bad verbiage on my part. I shouldn't be saying most common. What we often see is a percentage of the lease amount. Could be 10%, could be
10%.
right. Where this probably should be clarified is should be monthly lease or annual lease amount, which would be a nice
Mhm.
clarification.
That's usually the
But
first
if
one.
you choose, if you and the buyer agree to a flat fee, $500, and the lessor is only paying $200, then the buyer has to make up the $300.
That's harsh. Many buyers, many
No.
renters aren't gonna have it or want to pay it. And you're usually doing that as like a favor for the future buy.
Well,
Purchase.
remember, this is a buyer agency agreement. It includes leases, so we'll set the standards for what we believe is fair. And if you go off that, that's up to you. You'll just pay the company portion.
Mhm.
Diane, I'm sorry, Diane then Ed.
Okay, my question is, I do a lot of commercial leases and this is structured way different than what you're saying here. We usually get half of our annual, like for the whole amount of the lease when they sign, and then the other half is when they actually open or move in. How could we modify this to help in that
There's a-
situation? I usually write it in the letter of intent. Would that just override this?
Well, the letter of intent could be attached. You could come down to the additional terms and conditions and identify
Okay, write it in.
here in 133 through 138, or you could reference the letter of intent here in lines 133 through 138. Compensation to be distributed per letter of intent, and then reiterate what that is. But that's a great question. That's a great point that we may want to go back and add a paragraph, see if we can add a paragraph for lease option to purchase, and then maybe C would be for commercial, and then D would be the other. So thank you.
Okay, perfect.
Add that suggestion for the next revision, which will then also include mediation and arbitration.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. Anything? Ed, sorry, go.
On the option to purchase, right?
Yes, sir.
So what do you mean by the option amount? Like, well, like she was saying, kind of the same thing, like option to buy, it's gonna lease. So you're getting paid for the lease, but then if at the end there's a balloon payment of 50,000, whatever it is, do we still get paid on that, or is that completely out of the picture?
I think you're talking about a differentiation between the lease with an option to purchase
Right.
and just an option to buy. So someone can submit a letter of intent with an option to buy, or an individual could submit a
Right,
contract, which is an
talking about.
option purchase.
Right.
At the option purchase, when you submit an option purchase, you submit an amount that you would be willing to pay on your option versus leasing and then
Right.
optioning to purchase. So you would be paid on the option amount. So if I option to purchase at 600,000, I'm paying whatever is stated here as a percentage or flat fee in that option amount. If I'm doing a lease option to purchase, then I pay the whatever's identified as the percentage or flat amount for the lease that was executed, and I'm also paid on the option amount or closed amount. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
So the question I have is, so if they go through the 5-year lease agreement for a commercial, and then at the end, like, because I'm actually in this situation right now, writing an offer like this, and then they decide 3 years into it to purchase the property, this would cover me for if I wrote 3% in here, so for the purchase price.
Yes.
And if they're not willing, if the seller's agent or seller is not willing to pay me, then my buyer would have to.
Correct.
Okay, I love
Because
it.
as long as remember, I know that And that would probably be something customarily, we don't recommend more than a year on residential. But if it is a commercially oriented property, we would recommend a longer period of time based on the time that you're working with that individual, or you anticipate a lease. Or
So
two-
if we're right now writing a 5-year lease with 2 5-year options, I have to write 15 years. That's a long time.
I would write 5 with the option to extend it, obviously.
Okay.
And remember, you're covered that if they're still under contract when they renew that second lease period, as this buyer agreement still holds, as long as they're still under contract.
Oh,
The agreement
okay.
is automatically extended if they're under contract.
But if they've exercised the lease agreement, you're saying we're still under contract?
Well, if they've got 2 3-year options, 2 5-year options before purchase,
Uh-huh.
you would be paid on the 2 5-year options also, and then the purchase
Okay.
at the end of 15, because they're still under contract.
Okay.
Even though your initial contract period may only be 3 years or 5 years, when they went under contract for that property, or that option to purchase, despite the fact that there were 2 lease renewals, you would still be covered by the contract.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Are we okay to move on? Those are good questions. Thank you all, local and online. All right. The next paragraph is paragraph 6, which is the retainer. If applicable, so if you choose, upon execution of this agreement, the buyer will pay the broker a non-refundable retainer. So it's already identified as non-refundable retainer fee of X amount of dollars for broker services. This is a retainer. This fee is not refundable and will or will not be credited to the buyer if compensation is earned by the broker as specified in this agreement. So we've had this question a lot about, can we charge retainers? Can we charge retainers? Well, right here, it's telling us we can. So in this document, we could actually charge a buyer as a retainer. Say, great, to hire me for my professional services, it would be $500 or $700 or $300. Now that amount would have to go into an escrow account because it's a retainer. Despite the fact that it's non-refundable, we would want it to go into an escrow. Sorry. It would go into an escrow account if that money is to be credited. If the first box is checked, will be credited. So if that money will be credited, should the buyer go ahead and consummate a transaction with you, that would go into an escrow account. If it will not be credited, that can come straight into the brokerage and be paid out at your split.
Paid out when?
Paid out at your split. Paid out when? When would you get the monies for the retainer?
Yes.
If it will
Right.
not be credited, then
And
when
then
the
if they say-
cash
Yeah.
clears?
Until you are paid for the closing,
Mhm.
not upfront, because it may never close.
Okay, so you're talking about will versus will not.
Let's say you
So-
get $1,000 retainer,
Okay.
and you are not going to credit it against their future sale or any compensation. So basically, you're entitled to that retainer up front, aren't you?
Yep.
But you're saying whenever you
The
do-
question was if it was $1,000 retainer and it will not be credited to the buyer at closing, that money comes into the brokerage, check clears, gets split out between the agent and the brokerage based on the agent's
Oh, I
split.
didn't know you meant at the split. I thought you meant after closing.
Nope. So if the retainer is going to be credited to the buyer at closing, then the retainer would have to be held in an escrow account.
Thank you for clarifying
Yeah. We good?
it. Mhm.
All right, early termination. So the buyer may terminate this agreement at any time. Sorry, Ed?
Hold on. If it's not credited, what do you mean? It doesn't go into an escrow. So what, do you get it right then and there?
Right.
Okay.
If the retainer is not to be credited, let's just make sure we're clear on this. If you meet with the buyer and you and the buyer agree that your professional services, they're hiring you as a buyer's agent, and in order to retain your services, they will pay a fee of $1,000. If you and the buyer agree that that $1,000 will not be credited to them when they close on something, then the money comes into the brokerage cash check gets, the monies get distributed to you and the brokerage based on your split. If
At that time.
at that
time
time,
it's
because that
received.
money will not be credited at
Right.
closing, so there's
It's like-
nothing.
It's the broker's money automatic once it's checked.
Correct.
Yeah.
But once the will not box is checked.
Yeah.
If the will box is checked, in other words, we're going to credit, the brokerage is going to credit the buyer the retainer fee,
The
in
state
this
of
example,
escrow.
$1,000, and that $1,000 must go into an escrow account that would then get credited to the buyer at closing. It would be, since we do not have an escrow account, it would be held at one of the title companies. Therefore, what we want to do is you'd want to make sure that money gets credited or sent to the closing company, whoever's closing it, at least 5 days prior. Missy.
Here we go. While we're on this subject,
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like for you to clarify if I say, okay, I'm gonna start charging a retainer
Yes, ma'am.
for fair housing, wouldn't I have to do that with every buyer I work with? And not just pick and choose which buyers I want to do that?
You are exactly right. Just like any policy, absolutely. Thanks. Absolutely. If you're choosing to add, now we will give guidelines in the policies as they're revised as it relates to retainers, but just like anything, just like if I meet with a buyer and I take a copy of a buyer's license, and I do that for people that I've known for, that I'm just meeting, I have to do it for people that I've known forever too. So as you look at this and start to think about how you're doing business, you have to think about all of these other items that are influencing how we work. And fair housing is key in how we work. So just like anything, if you do for one, you have to do for everyone. If you choose to take a retainer, you must take it for everyone. And
You
the
just have to
retainer
ask
must be
everyone.
consistent. Excuse
You
me?
just have to ask everyone to make a choice.
No. If you are taking, if I meet with you and I say my retainer is, and I've known you for 15 minutes, and I say, well, I'm happy to work with you, Ed, but my retainer is $500.
That's what I mean. You gotta tell out to everybody.
Yeah, I gotta, whether I've known you for 15
Right.
minutes and then I go to Yasmin and I've known her
Right.
for 10 years, and I go over to Diane and I've known her for 20 years, I still have to say, well, my retainer is $500. My retainer is $500. The retainer has to be consistent.
Right.
What doesn't necessarily have to be consistent is whether you say will or will not
Mhm.
be credited.
But you have to ask everybody.
Well,
You
no, you don't have to
tell-
ask
no,
everyone.
tell.
If you use a retainer, it has to be used with everyone.
Right, yes, everybody that you have.
Yeah, it's not that you have to ask them. You have to,
Next.
if you're
Is that
gonna,
gonna be the norm? Most people will ask for a retainer. I know you can't because of antitrust say everybody will, but can you say it's gonna be a typical thing?
no, you can't.
You can't.
Nope.
And can I ask you another thing about antitrust? Isn't that something to do with a monopoly? Is it because we're the only game in town that they can call this an antitrust problem?
No, antitrust is another term that you can use related to antitrust would be collusion. So antitrust isn't necessarily a monopoly. A monopoly would, the courts would say that a monopoly can't occur because it's not fair trade. For antitrust, what antitrust is saying is that you have a company and you have a company and you have a company, and you guys are talking and setting standards in commissions or compensation or payment in some way that is not making it a fair market, that a buyer can't negotiate with you or a seller can't negotiate with you. So that's what the Sherman Act for antitrust is saying. It doesn't have to be one company. It doesn't have to be monopoly. Antitrust actually is different companies communicating, setting standards that do not allow or prohibit or limit a buyer, or in our case, buyer or seller's ability to negotiate. So it has nothing to do with monopoly. It has to do with the talk. So if I'm with brokerage A and there's somebody with brokerage B, and we say, well, we charge 6%, and brokerage B says, oh, well, we're only charging 5%, but I guess if you're charging 6%, we can charge 6%. That's antitrust, because each company has its own business model. And if you look at real estate, we have, and exaggerating, but we have 122 different business models. Actually, probably not by much, but we have 122 different business models. So some people charge X, some people charge Y, some people charge for this, some people don't charge for that. You have pay for play brokerages that say, if you give me $500, I'll put it in MLS. If you give me another $300, I'll give you a document. If you give me another $700, I'll negotiate. I mean, so there are all sorts of different business
But the
models.
company has set fees, I mean, set charges to its agents,
Our brokerage does, yes.
right? And that's not the same thing as antitrust?
No, because we set the guidelines for our brokerage. We don't tell other brokerages what to do.
Mhm.
I mean, if that were the case, we don't have any fees that we charge. We charge one fee, E&O. Other brokerages charge E&O, tech fees, application fees, all these other fees. So that's their business model. This is our business model. So long as we're talking about educating our agents in our company on what our standards are, it's not antitrust, because we're not telling other brokerages what to do, nor are we trying to influence other brokerages what to do or
Thank
charge.
you for that.
Anybody else want to say, miss anything? Any other hands up? Or are we okay? Okay. All right. How did we get with early termination? I think we got very far. Buyer may terminate this agreement at any time by written notice to broker, but will remain responsible for paying the broker's compensation if, from the early termination date to the termination date, plus the protection period, the buyer contracts to acquire any property which, prior to the early termination date, was found or discovered by the buyer or called to buyer's attention by the broker or any other person. The broker may terminate this agreement at any time by written notice to the buyer, in which event the buyer and the broker will be released from all further obligations under this agreement, except for the indemnity and hold harmless provisions in paragraphs 8 hereof. So that may help clarify some of the early termination elements of it. They can terminate, or we can terminate. Again, if they've now gone to another agent, then we might have a more difficult time saying that we're owed compensation. If they want to go to another agent and then buy a property that we showed them, but we could potentially say that maybe there was an opportunity. So that's with early termination. If it's expired, probably not. Disputes and waiver of jury trial costs and attorney's fees hold harmless indemnification. All controversies and claims between the buyer and the broker, directly or indirectly, arising out of or relating to this agreement or the property, will be determined by non-jury trial. The buyer and the broker hereby knowingly, voluntarily, and intentionally waive any and all right to a trial by jury in any litigation, action, or proceeding involving the buyer or the broker, whether arising directly or indirectly from the agreement or the property or relating thereto. The buyer fails to perform any of the buyer's obligations under this agreement, and if litigation ensues, buyer agrees to pay brokers reasonable attorney's fees and costs. The buyer agrees to indemnify and hold the broker harmless from and against all losses, damages, costs, and expenses of any kind, including attorney's fees, and from liability to any person or entity that the broker incurs because of acting on buyer's behalf. This will be expanded to include mediation and arbitration. So this is the paragraph that will be expanded in the newest version. Don't know, this is a lot of legalese. I don't know if there's any questions on that. Comments that anyone wants to share?
I mean, it's something you have to go through the client right away.
Okay,
I mean, the last thing you explained is
all right.
buyer thing, that's gonna, yeah.
So remember, technically, unless you have your law degree and an attorney, we're not supposed to be interpreting this. We should be taking them through it. We should be answering their questions openly and honestly. And if they have concerns, please direct them to, a real estate attorney. So that's who they should be having those questions with. You can give an idea, but remember, we shouldn't be interpreting. Oh, question? Did I miss something? Okay. Wire fraud alert. We internally, we don't do a lot of wiring. We've seen some bad things happen, but most title companies are set up pretty strongly. Just please remind your customers that wiring can be a liability, and to please have them contact you and the title company, or one or the other at least, before making any wires or wiring any funds, especially if they've received a letter, email, or notification. Any additional terms and conditions are identified starting in line 133. I think that Diane's point about commercial is well pointed. And as you find things that may not be covered here, I think it's great to send those over to me, and we'll get them to Real MLS and the attorney to determine whether or not they should be added or how they should be added. This is a constantly living, breathing document, like most of our documents. So we'll be updating those. Acknowledgement modifications, line 139. Acknowledgement modifications, the buyer has read this agreement and understands its contents. The buyer acknowledges receipt of a signed copy of this agreement. This agreement cannot be modified except by written agreement between all parties hereto. So just so you're aware, this is the buyer agency agreement that's come out as of December. We already know there's going to be some changes to it. Plus, there's going to be additional forms that will come from this to help you should you need extensions or modifications to this agreement. At this time, if you fill a buyer agency agreement out and need to make an adjustment to it, you can do it on the form, but please remember there should be initial signatures and dates. If you choose to use a blank amendment, that will suffice. The amendment will suffice. Reference the buyer agency agreement, or minor things like, and nothing is minor, I shouldn't use that word, but things like extension in the time frame can be done in an email. Please not texts. Texts still are not identified as acceptable because they can be changed or deleted. So in emails would probably be the best way to go. And I think that's a good sound for us to kind of start to think of.
You think you'd hear that?
Then just have the buyer. Notice we have the address here, phone number, email. Good for contacting. Then we've got the broker firm name, broker phone, broker firm address. That would be the address where your license is situated. And then signature of the licensee, again representing the brokerage. We've got a little bit of background noise on some of the calls. If you wouldn't mind just muting yourself, unless you would like to make a comment regarding the agreement, please. And then the email address. All right, so this is the Missy, please.
So, and what I wanted to just, and we may not go into this today, Clark.
No problem.
But I think that what the next step in this is to explain the correct way to, if the buyer wants you to include paying your commission in the offer, what the correct way is to do that. So that might be another call, but I think it's an appropriate process to explain so that it's
Absolutely.
done correctly.
Yeah, and that's why we've added the buyer consultation, a couple of buyer consultation roundtables, as well as reviewing buyer consultations, updating buyer consultations, and then we may even be having a fun exchange of your buyer consultation. But that's exactly what we'll be talking about that. Thank you for making sure that comes to the surface, because we've got to start to understand what we can offer, because this is going to be freaky for us, but it's going to be freaky for our buyers too, right? Wait a minute. I thought you were free. Remember, we can't say free anymore. I mean, you were paid,
Right.
so you really weren't free. So being able to talk to them about not only how the compensation flows, which is addressed in the agreement, but then what are their options if we get into a situation where they are responsible for a portion or all of the compensation. How can some of that be offset? What terminology can we use? What can we put into a purchase and sale agreement? So that will all come down at the buyer consult discussion. Yes.
It will also play a part in a seller accepting an offer. If someone comes in and the buyer is paying all your compensation, and you're asking the seller to pay that compensation that's listed in the listing agreement.
Well, wait a minute. Let's clarify. So if there is a listing agreement, the listing agreement dictates what the compensation is to the listing brokerage. If the seller has chosen to compensate the buyer's brokerage, that will also appear in the listing agreement. Right now, it appears you take a total and you break out a section for the different types of representation. However, if there is a buyer agreement, or if there's compensation being requested, if the buyer is requesting compensation, let me back up. If a buyer and the brokerage have agreed to compensation, that's the buyer's responsibility. If the buyer should choose to ask for compensation or concessions from the seller in a particular amount or a particular percentage, that needs to be identified as closing costs, not as commission.
Oh, you can't ask them to pay the seller's commission.
The buyer's commission.
Okay, of the buyer's broker's commission.
So no, the buyer's broker commission is an agreement between the buyer and the brokerage, which would be something that would go to the title company to show up on the closing statement. If the buyer is asking the seller for concessions, you and the buyer need to understand what concessions the buyer needs assistance with. Is it closing costs? And a commission would be a closing cost.
Oh.
So identifying, and for lending purposes, right now it would be
So it doesn't affect the appraisal, lending purposes.
Not the appraisal. It has nothing to do with the appraisal.
Oh.
It has to do with the lending guidelines. In other words,
Oh, right. Yeah.
what a buyer can pay, what a buyer can't pay.
But in the financing.
Correct. So yes.
So
Yes.
so we need to send this document to the closing company too, because they need to pay us.
Okay, so the agreement,
No.
the question is, do we need to send the buyer agency agreement to the title company? No, you do not send the buyer agency agreement to the title company. You would send the buyer, what you send to the title company is what we currently send to the title company, is either the commission disbursement authorization, which is the authorization that allows you to get paid at closing. So the compensation would be identified in there. The responsibility of the buyer would be on that sheet that goes to the title company, so that the title company knows what expenses to put on the buyer's side. So you wouldn't share the agreement, just like you wouldn't share a listing agreement. You would share the compensation, the CDA, or commission disbursement agreement, and or the activity form. That would come from Teresa and go to the title company, and it would identify what expenses the buyer is responsible for related to the brokerage.
But we send the listing agreement.
No, you never send a listing agreement to the title company. Never.
Why? I've had, Landmark Title will pull your, title search immediately is upon listing, even if you don't even have a contract on it. I've always done that my whole
But you don't
life.
send them the listing agreement.
The listing, so it's showing that they're going to be, the listing agreement is where the seller has chosen Landmark Title. And they know that they're going to do it, so they're going to be the title company anyway. They may not know who the buyer is, but they will pull they'll do everything.
So I think we're talking about a couple of different things. So first of all, the listing agreement does not dictate who the title company will be. That's not on
That's
anywhere on the,
something that
No, that's just
you've
escrow.
already discussed with the seller.
so let's clarify. The listing agreement does not indicate who the title company will be to manage the closing. The only thing that the listing agreement states is what the seller's obligations are when it comes to closing costs.
Mhm.
One of the closing costs is title. Owner's title policy, title exam. The seller is allowed to choose who they would like to close it.
Yeah,
It's not identified anywhere in the listing agreement.
yeah, but we're assuming that you've discussed that with them and they've agreed to Landmark.
Well, I don't know who they've agreed to. So the seller can choose whomever they would like to close it. If they ask for recommendations and you choose to give them a recommendation of Landmark, that's great.
That would be in the purchase and sale agreement that has that, not the listing.
Well, the offer instructions, if the seller and the listing broker have agreed, or the listing agent on behalf of the listing brokerage have agreed that Landmark or J. Riley or whomever will do the closing, it would be best to disclose that on offer instructions. Absolutely, so that the agent working with the buyer is able to put that into the purchase and sale agreement. There's nothing that dictates that. If you would like to have a pre-title done and you talk to the seller and you and the seller agree that you would like to have a pre-title search done just to ensure there are no unknown liens out there, then you and the seller would have to agree to who would be doing that. It's very common for a title company to do a pre-listing search or a listing, a pre-lien search or a lien search once you have the listing, but we don't share the listing agreement with the title company in order for them to do that.
I didn't know that, because they've actually found a husband that someone didn't list.
Well, that's a title issue. That's not sharing the listing agreement with them.
Just sharing the address. Basically, you could give them.
You
the
can-
address.
you can-
All it requires is purchase agreement, not the listing.
The title company would need the purchase and sale agreement,
Absolutely.
yes. Right, not the listing
Okay,
agreement.
so.
We don't
it's
send the
not
listing
typical
agreement, but if-
Forever, because I have a relationship with them.
No, forget.
I don't think you actually share the listing agreement with them. You may give them the listing address.
Okay,
Have you been sending the listing agreement to them?
if they've asked for it, yeah, they
Well, they
do.
don't usually ask for it. So, all right, so let's just be clear. We don't share listing agreements with any party. So we wouldn't be sharing buyer agency agreements with any party. How does the brokerage get paid? The compensation by the buyer. The compensation to the brokerage from the buyer would be identified on your closing disbursement agreement, which shows what the costs are and what the expenses are to the buyer and how the monies that are going to be paid to the brokerage will flow. The activity form or the closing disclosure will also, compensation disclosure agreement will also show what the seller is being charged for, or what the seller's charges are if you're working on the listing side. That will be reflective of the listing agreement, but will not include the listing agreement. So same way that the title companies currently understand what compensation will flow or what expenses will flow, buyer or seller, that's done from the brokerage to the title company, not through the listing agreement or the buyer agency agreement.
From the broker to the title, so the broker will send them the listing agreement and the contract.
The brokerage will never send the listing agreement.
Oh, okay. That's right, they get a purchase and sale agreement.
So the purchase and sale agreement, the agent will share the purchase and sale agreement with the title company. Most often, the listing agent sends the purchase and sale agreement to the title company once they've gone under contract and begins the process of title search and exam, unless you started
Sorry, I
a
must have been confused.
that's fine.
Apologize.
No, we want to make sure that the clarification is there.
No worries, I was in the same time.
Yeah.
So-
We're all talking the same thing.
Mhm.
Anything we want to add about that? Okay. Are we good? Everybody
Are we
okay?
talking about these or not? What are the 197 ones?
So the
179.
if you came on late or if you didn't get a chance to see them in the chat, there were 4 documents. One was the buyer agency agreement that we went through. The other 3 documents, one is the 179 ways. That's part and parcel of the 179 things that you do to help your buyers and sellers. And then there's the additional 105 ways that focuses on buyer value. So these are the documents that I think are good to start adding to your buyer consult. But you should be reviewing these to establish more of your own value propositions or how you want to dictate or share your value propositions. So those were in the chat, and you can download those from the chat,
Chat.
or they're here
I don't know what you mean, chat.
online.
I saw the invitation, I didn't see a chat.
Well, for those people who are currently online, there's a box called chat so that they can ask questions, and that's how we communicate.
So you got
Yeah.
I have to explain anything specifically.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Syed. Anybody else have anything they want to go ahead and add? I'm going to go ahead and stop this share, so we'll go back and see all your pretty faces that have turned off your cameras. Not fair, not fair.
Bye. That's the only one left.
No, everybody's here. Anybody there? Nick, Adolfo, Valerie, Val, you guys, and Marge, anybody got anything they want to add? Any specific questions?
No, it's all good.
All right, Marge, it's all good. You're gonna get me later, aren't you, Marge? I know you will.
Hey, Marge. It's Kim.
She made over. Marge, Kim said hello. Kim Kessler said hi.
We know each other.
Oh, hello.
Hey, Marge, it's Kim Kessler.
I haven't seen you in ages.
I know. I'm sort of an invisible agent.
All right, you guys, take it to a text. Anyway, all right. All right, everybody else okay?
Secret agent.
If everybody else is okay, I'm going to stop recording, and I'm going to also, what are we going to do? I think we're just going to sign off. We okay?